Democrats, I hope, will agree that we need to do some cutting, and we need to wind up somewhere in the middle. That's the only way we're going to get this thing back on track. This budget doesn't cut it. This budget doesn't even come close to it. We're going to bankrupt America if we don't start doing things differently. Senator Johans, I see Senator Isaacson has joined us on the floor.
I thank my colleagues for laying out what this budget is all about and the problems that we are seeing. Senator Isaacson has been a leader in trying to reform the budget process. Senator Isaacson, I'd like you to offer thoughts on what you see in this budget and some ideas on how we can improve this situation that we find ourselves in with the President's budget just wanting more taxing, more borrowing, more spending.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity. I commend Senator Risch on his remarks. I want to make a little addition to those in just a second. But in specifically the answer to your question, Senator Johans, the only thing you can do with this budget is start over. And Senator Risch, is very important to recognize the 10-year fiasco that we look at every year by pushing savings out into years 8, 9, and 10 when this president won't be here and another Congress will be here. One of the things that, in talking about compromise, one of the things that Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire and I have pushed for 2 years is a process that 40% of the states operate under, including yours, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Johans, and that is a biennial budget process. So instead of talking about 10 years, you talk about 2. And instead of talking about appropriating every year, you appropriate 1 year for 2 years. And the second year, which happens to be the election year or the even-numbered year, your total obligation is to look for savings, efficiencies, and find function in the government. You know, we don't ever do in this Congress what our families do and our children do every year at home. We don't ever sit around our kitchen table, reprioritize our expenditures based on our needs, and find out how to live within our means. The American people don't get the luxury of printing money. Japan doesn't come in and buy notes to fund their money. They have to figure out how they themselves can manage their budget in such a way to live within the income they have and not go into a big debt. The United States of America ought to do the same thing. And one of the things Senator Risch hit on that I really want to hammer on for just a second, because there is a big part of our problem that is solvable. And it's solvable if good people would just be willing to talk about it rather than politic about it. And that's one thing known as entitlements. Entitlements are Social Security, welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, retirement, disability, etc. But really 2 of them aren't really entitlements. 2 of them are obligations of the United States of America. That's not an entitlement. That's something somebody's paid for. America's people pay 6.2% of their payroll normally, except for the recent holiday we've had, to go into a Social Security trust fund to pay them a benefit. They pay 1.35% of their income every month from day one since 1968 to pay for Medicare. Those aren't entitlements they're entitled to. Those are obligations we've committed them to for monies that they've paid. And this document that we're looking at, this budget, doesn't portend a single change in benefits or in obligations for Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, which simply means the day that they go broke comes that much faster. We're defaulting on the obligation we have to the American people, whereas if we sat down honestly, put those programs on the table, looked in the out years when my grandchildren and children may be beneficiaries and modified the obligation, pushing out the eligibility, we can save the debt, the obligation that we owe to the American people for Social Security and for Medicare. But if we don't do it, it will be gone. And that's something they paid for that we took out of the trust fund and used for something else, not the least of which was the $500 billion the President took out of the trust fund for Medicare to end up helping to pay for the Affordable Health Care bill, which hasn't even gone into effect yet. So I think it's time we ask of ourselves what the American people have to ask of themselves. Sit around our kitchen table, decide what our priorities are, live with our means, and budget for the future. Don't budget for failure. This is a budget for failure.
I appreciate the comments made by Senator Isaacson, and if I might take a moment to follow up on his comments relative to Medicare and Social Security. And then I would ask Senator Blunt maybe to offer a few words on where we go from here. What do we anticipate we've got to do to set the ship of state on the right course, if you will? But let me just speak to the issue of Medicare and Social Security. Senator Isaacson could not be more right When we get paid, you can literally go to your paycheck stub and you can see the amount of money that is being withheld out of your paycheck throughout your life for Social Security benefits and for Medicare benefits. When these programs were set up, thereabouts, a group was put together. They're referred to as trustees, and they basically do a fair analysis of where these programs are at and where they are headed. And every year they put out a report. And we'll be getting another annual report here in the not-too-distant future. But I think we all know what the report is going to say. The report is going to say that in the vicinity of about 2024, if not a bit sooner, Social Security literally is going to be insolvent. It's also going to say that Medicare is literally in a position where it will be upside down financially sooner than that. The greatest challenge between the two, obviously, is Medicare. Now, what does that mean to people who are currently beneficiaries or fixing to retire and planning on these items being there for them? Well, what it means is that that plan could be in serious jeopardy. Now, it's not because Mike Johanns woke up last night and said that or dreamt it or thought about it. It's because people who are empowered to look at Social Security and Medicare have studied it very, very closely, have looked at the financial pieces of this, and have come to this conclusion. So now let's examine the President's budget. What plan does he have to protect Medicare or Social Security? Well, he doesn't have a plan. These aren't easy issues. I'm not arguing here today that this is easy to take on, but what I am saying to the American people is if you study this budget or any other budget submitted by this President, he is doing nothing to arrest literally our progress toward these very important programs becoming insolvent. If there was ever an area in this budget where we need presidential leadership, it is right here. Senator Blunt, I'd ask your thoughts on this. You've studied these issues over the years and offered great insight. Where do we go from here? What are your thoughts in terms of this budget and how we get back on track?
I think, Senator, my first thought here is that the insight's not really that difficult. It's just we need to do our job. We can't expect to solve these problems if the Senate doesn't do the job it's supposed to do. And we can't expect to solve these problems if we keep letting the size of our government get out of proportion to the capacity of our economy. In 2008, the year before the administration started, the deficit was higher than I thought it should be by a lot. It was $459 billion. That was 3% of GDP, and I thought that was unacceptable. The very next year, the first year of this administration, it went to 10% of GDP, $1.4 trillion. And then after that, it's been a trillion, 1.4 trillion, 1.3 trillion, 1.3 trillion, 1.3 trillion in the year we're in now. And this doesn't change that trajectory at all. And in the budget the President submitted, for the first time that any President said this, the President says that the Social Security Trust Fund during this 10-year window will run out of money, that the money coming in for the first time ever will not equal the money going out, but proposes nothing to do anything about that. This is a commitment that the federal government has made to Americans. Social Security can continue to work if you periodically look at the facts and the demographics and adjust it. We've just about worn out the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan example on Social Security, but, Senators, that was 1983, this supposed third rail of politics that the President won't touch. The very next year, Ronald Reagan carried 49 states, This would have been a great year in divided government to solve this problem because one side couldn't spend the rest of time blaming the other. I don't think the changes in Social Security made in 1983, to my knowledge, have never been an issue in any political campaign anywhere. And because they were made in a way that anticipated people's needs to adjust, we're just now, 30 years later, getting to the final phase-in of the new retirement age. 30 years later. But if you don't get that started, you'll never get there. And whether it's Social Security or the Social Security Insurance Fund gets into trouble even quicker, according to the President, 2018. And no proposal to do anything about that. People who are absolutely dependent, family members, dependent children who are absolutely dependent on that safety net if something happens to the worker who's paying into Social Security. 5 years from now, the President says that's in big trouble, but you go through all of these papers and you see no indication anywhere of what we should do about that. These are issues that have to be dealt with, and I just suggest the most fundamental way to deal with them is for the Senate to do its job, for the Senate to produce a budget, for the Senate to get focused, as Senator Risch suggested we needed to focus not on some phony pay-for 10 years out that never materializes, but what are we going to do this year to change the course of the country, to change the trajectory. You know, one thing you learn in artillery is you don't have to change the trajectory, you don't have to change the level of the artillery piece very much to make a really big difference out there in the distance. But if you don't change it at all, you keep landing at exactly the same place. And this is a budget that actually lands in even a worse place because it spends more money, it spends too much, it taxes too much, it borrows too much, and the American people know we can't continue to do that, as a case very well made by Senator Risch. Senator, do you have any other thoughts on what we need to be doing and how we need to be doing it?
Well, I think, first of all, one of the things that people have got to accept, and it doesn't happen around here, and that is we don't have an income problem. We've got a spending problem. There is no money, all the money in the world wouldn't get us to where you are able to solve every problem that comes down the pike and that people want to resolve. The President is urging that somebody's not paying their fair share. Now, I wish he would hang more details on it. I wish some media person would ask him, identify these groups for us, please. I think he's trying to create a national dialogue as to who is or who isn't paying their fair share. I think that might be appropriate. I think when the American people started on this and they took the numbers and said, okay, if you take the first half of income earners from the lowest to the median, they're paying 0% in taxes. The top 10% is paying 70% of all the money that the government takes in. So let's have a dialogue as to which of those two groups is paying their fair share. There are some very good sociological reasons why the upper income pays more than the lower income, and I don't think anyone is going to argue with that. But there's only so much you can do, and I'm not here defending the rich. The rich take care of themselves. They can move their capital wherever they want to move it to, and indeed we all know that the good deal of it is moved offshore. There's $2 trillion offshore right now that American businesses want to bring back. But they won't bring it back because there's a war on capital here in this country with the government trying to take the capital. We need to have a national dialogue about that, and we need to land in the middle someplace. Again, no one is going to defend the rich. They don't have to. The rich can take care of themselves. But the fact is, we've got to come to the conclusion at some point that the resources of the American people are finite, be it the rich, be it the poor, be it the middle class. Their ability to pay for government is finite. And there's a point at which you've got to say, wait, instead of saying we're going to bring in more, we've got to say we're going to have to prioritize the money that we have and how we're going to spend it. And I think it's that way that we get out of this situation, is having an acceptance that there is a finite amount of money. it's really too easy for us to borrow money. We've seen that in our own lives. We've seen friends of ours who have gone down to the bank and borrowed money, and if the money is too easy to borrow, they get into trouble, and they get into trouble relatively quickly. Well, we've gotten into trouble because it is so easy for us to borrow. People still want to loan us money. People are still loaning us money every day. They lend us billions and billions. And indeed, if they didn't, we would be out of business. So it's time for this national dialogue on where we're going to go. And as I said, the only way this is going to resolve is if we compromise. And instead of talking about compromise about how much more we're going to spend, we need to do something we haven't done since World War II, and that is compromise.
Time has expired.
On how much we're going to cut. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. President, thank you, and I anticipate Senator Heller will probably seek the floor, but this concludes our colloquy, and I yield the floor.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination. The judiciary, Alaberto Jose Jordan of Florida to be United States Circuit Judge for the 11th Circuit.
See if he's ready.
Mr. President.
Senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, I ask for unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for a period of up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, our nation is more than $15 trillion in debt. The President's budget will increase government spending by $47 trillion over the next decade. Included is the largest tax increase in American history, while our national debt increases to $25.9 trillion over the next 10 years. That's right. This budget proposes a massive tax increase, not as a plan to address the national debt, but to fuel more reckless big government spending. Our nation cannot afford to continue down this path. This reckless budget will not only saddle our children and grandchildren with massive government debt, but it proposes to raise taxes on the very businesses that we need to create jobs. How can this President and the majority party claim to be pro-jobs when everything they're doing is anti-business? This budget threatens our long-term economic security and places a greater burden on our children and grandchildren who will be forced to live and pay for Washington's inability to solve this problem. And while I believe the President's budget spends too much, borrows too much, and taxes too much, here in the Senate, the majority party has chosen to go to the other extreme. They have now refused to pass a budget for more than 1,000 days. It is our responsibility as legislators to develop a real workable budget that will put our nation back on the path of economic prosperity. Unfortunately, the majority has simply not taken this responsibility seriously. Now, there are some who claim the spending caps established in the Budget Control Act constitutes a budget. And quite frankly, I disagree. At a time when millions of Americans are out of work, this behavior in Washington continues to create great uncertainty and stifles economic growth. No state has felt the failures of Washington more than the state of Nevada. My state continues to lead the nation in unemployment, with more than 160,000 Nevadans looking for a job. With the so-called stimulus plans, cash for clunkers, and bailouts, Washington's response to our economic problems have been woefully inadequate and, in Nevada, a complete failure. Here's the kind of stories that I hear all too often from my fellow Nevadans. You may recall You may recall that my wife Pam and I own the Straw Hat Pizza here in Carson. Pam has owned and operated the restaurant since May of 1985. Unfortunately, after 25 years of operation, today is our last day of being in business. We are forced to close our doors and likely file for bankruptcy due to the horrible economic situation in our state and Carson City in particular. It's a true tragedy. The lifelong endeavor ends this way, and Pam feels that she is a failure. I keep reminding her that the failure was not hers, but rather a failure of liberal elected officials to do what's right for our country and get out of the way. Let free enterprise work its magic, and in turn, let individuals flourish. Members of Congress are willfully refusing to put our nation on a path of long-term fiscal responsibility, creating greater uncertainty, contributing to an anemic economy that is forcing small businesses to close their doors. As long as this is the case, Americans will continue to be frustrated and angry with Washington's inability to produce real results. Our nation's capital remains the only place in the country where difficult decisions are not made. Congress continually kicks the can down the road, leaving tough fiscal decisions for future Congresses, future administrations, and worse, the next generation. In light of these facts, is it really any mystery why Congress is currently experiencing its worst approval ratings in history? I introduced the no budget, no pay to force Congress to face reality, take responsibility for running this country. This bipartisan legislation requires that the Senate and House of Representatives pass a budget and all appropriation bills by the beginning of each fiscal year. Failure to do so would result in the loss of pay until Congress takes its job seriously. If Congress does not complete its constitutional duties, then its members should not be paid. It's that simple. If you do not do your job, then you should not be paid. This concept resonates with the American people. I know this because I've asked Nevadans during a series of telephone town hall meetings last year whether they supported a bill that would hold members of Congress's pay if they failed to pass a budget. More than 4,000 Nevadans participated in this poll, and 84% of them supported the no budget, no pay concept. The budget is not a trivial piece of legislation or a campaign document. It is a roadmap that identifies goals, priorities, and establishes a multi-year fiscal course for the nation. If done right, it can provide stability and set expectations for where we want to take our nation. Budgeting is not a strange concept. It is something that is done at all levels of government, businesses large and small, and every kitchen table across the country. It is past time for Congress to actually implement policies that would encourage the economic growth we need to ensure that workers can have good jobs and provide for their families. While the No Budget, No Pay Act will not solve every problem here in Washington, I sincerely believe it would be a step in the right direction. These essential functions of Congress are vital to fiscal responsibility and creating greater certainty so our job creators can flourish. I was pleased to see reports of growth, small growth in our economy, but lack of clarity provided by Washington continues to hamper economic growth. Back home, Nevadans continue to struggle. Small businesses are trying to survive, while gridlock in Washington is making it harder for employers to know what to expect in the coming year. Establishing a responsible budget would be a good first step towards placing our nation on the path to a more prosperous future. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kentucky.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, some senators are concerned that I may be delaying a vote in the Senate. This is not true. I offered yesterday to vote on my amendment with 10 minutes of discussion. I've offered to vote immediately at any point in time, but I do think it's worth 10 minutes of our time and 10 minutes of Americans' time to discuss the plight of U.S. citizens in Egypt. I do not think that 10 minutes is too much to ask that we discuss, debate, and vote on whether or not Egypt should continue to get aid from us while detaining our citizens. Egypt is unlawfully preventing U.S. citizens from leaving their country. I do not think that 10 minutes is too much to ask. We've sent over $60 billion in aid to Egypt over the years, and they now hold 19 U.S. citizens virtually hostage. Will we ever learn? Will we ever learn that you can't buy friendship? 19 U.S. citizens who traveled to Egypt to help Egypt embrace democracy, to help Egypt have an elected government and enjoy the freedoms that we enjoy here, and the success that we've enjoyed here having a democratic government. They are now being prevented from leaving Egypt. Some of these pro-democracy workers, in fact, are now seeking refuge in the U.S. Embassy. This is a tragedy. This is something that we should make a clear and unequivocal statement about. Does Egypt wish to be part of the civilized world, or do they wish to descend into the lawlessness of the third world? Now, some have argued that we don't need these provisions, that there are already provisions in place to prevent Egypt from getting aid. Well, apparently the Egyptians aren't listening, and they need to listen very clearly. The amendment that I have proposed will end all aid to Egypt, economic aid and military aid. We give over $1.5 billion to Egypt every year, and we cannot continue to give aid to a country that is detaining illegally our U.S. citizens. Now, some have said the provisions that we already have take care of this. There's a couple of problems. The Egyptians aren't hearing that message, so the message needs to be louder and more firm. We will not tolerate any country holding U.S. citizens as hostage or lawlessly. I think Egypt needs to know that America means business, and that's what this debate is all about. And so I don't think it's too much to ask the Senate to consider this proposal on Egypt, spend 10 minutes, and let's have a vote to send a message to Egypt. The question is, will we ever learn? Will we ever learn that you can't buy friendship? Will we ever learn that you can't create Democrats out of authoritarians simply by buying them off? We've tried it. We've sent billions of dollars to Africa and asked authoritarians who rape and pillage their people, who torture their own people, we give them more money trying to convince them to be Democrats. It hasn't worked. We need to have a firmer hand, and a firmer hand says no more aid to countries that detain U.S. citizens, no more aid to countries that don't allow their citizens to vote, no more aid to countries who torture and rape and pillage their populations. We've sent billions of dollars to Afghanistan, and it's an insult to Americans, and particularly to American soldiers, that the president of Pakistan has said if there were a war, no, the president of Afghanistan has said if there were a war, that he would side with Pakistan against the United States. Will we ever learn that we send money, billions of dollars to these countries, and apparently they still dislike us, disrespect us, and say they will side with our enemies? We now have officials in Pakistan. Pakistan's gotten billions of dollars from us. We now have officials in Pakistan saying that Pakistan will side with Iran. So Afghanistan's telling us they will side with Pakistan. Pakistan's saying they will side with Iran. And what does the chump, what does the U.S. taxpayer get? Send more money. Number one, we don't even have the money. We're borrowing the money from China. But we were asked to send more money to people who disrespect us. I think that's an insult and should end. Will we ever learn? Will we ever learn that you can't buy friendship? Will we ever learn that authoritarians, no matter how much money you give them, will not become Democrats? Egypt must be put on notice, and the President is not leading on this issue. Just a few weeks ago, the President's Undersecretary of State, Robert Hormat, stated that he wanted to make sure that the administration assured the Egyptians that we want to provide more immediate benefits. Do you think that's sending a wrong message to the Egyptians? They're detaining 19 U.S. citizens, preventing them from leaving, preventing them from coming home. U.S. citizens are holed up in our embassy, and the administration says we need to make sure that the benefits get there immediately. The administration is bragging about sending more aid to Egypt. Just yesterday, the President comes out with a new budget. Guess what? There's $1.5 billion of taxpayer money to be sent to Egypt. What kind of message are we sending them? I think the President is not leading the country, is not exemplifying what most Americans would want. And that is to send a clear and unequivocal message to Egypt that we will not tolerate this behavior, we will not subsidize this behavior. Think of it, the American taxpayers being asked to subsidize a government that is detaining U.S. citizens. The American taxpayers being asked to subsidize Pakistan, who says they would side with Iran. The American citizen, the American taxpayers being asked to subsidize Afghanistan, who says they would side with Pakistan against us. All the while we're running trillion-dollar deficits. All the while we're borrowing this money. All the while we're bankrupting our country. The Egyptians need to be sent a clear and unequivocal message. I think it's worth 10 minutes of the Senate's time to have a vote on this. I think it's worth it for the 19 U.S. citizens. If it were my child in Egypt working there for a pro-democracy group, I would want to think that the Senate did have 10 minutes of time. I would want to think that the Senate could spare 10 minutes of time to send the Egyptians an unequivocal signal that we will not tolerate this and you must let our citizens come home. The United States will not and should not stand for detention of American citizens, for imprisonment or travel restrictions on citizens. The United States should not send aid to a government that so casually accuses American citizens of political crimes. So while some will say I'm holding up the business of the Senate, I will argue that this is the business of the Senate, that foreign policy was delegated, much of it, to the United States Senate, that we are abdicating our role, and that we as the United States Senate should send a clear and unequivocal message to Egypt. So I will continue to argue, despite much opposition, to have a vote on this to send a signal to Egypt that we will not tolerate the detention of U.S. citizens. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield back the remainder of my time and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Just a few moments ago, you heard from Kentucky Senator Rand Paul talking about his proposal on a vote on Egypt and a vote of disapproval of the detention of U.S. citizens many from non-governmental organizations in Egypt, some 19 U.S. citizens. He would like to make it part of the discussion on the transportation bill. So that's Senator Paul. Congressional Quarterly writes about that. The Democratic leaders would like to turn their attention to that transportation bill, but an obstacle to that plan emerged late yesterday when it became clear that Senator Paul would not allow the expedited consideration of the nomination that's currently on the House floor, this nomination of Jose Jordan to be a judge on the 11th Circuit. And that is the pending business in the Senate as this quorum call continues. But again, you heard from Senator Paul insisting that he get debate on his proposed resolution.